In Vladimir Putin's rambling war declaration on Thursday morning, he threw everything at the wall in hopes something might stick. He didn't just cite the Iraq war, the Balkans, the US intervention in Syria. He didn't just perform his usual rewriting of history, claiming Ukrainian land is Russian land. He also said this, and I quote, "We will seek to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine." Later, he addressed Ukrainian soldiers directly, saying, quote, "Your fathers, grandfathers, and great-grandfathers did not fight the Nazi occupiers and did not defend our common motherland to allow today's neo-Nazis to seize power in Ukraine." All of which seems awfully weird since Ukraine is not a Nazi country.
In place of the defiant speeches, the somber strains of Beethoven now ring out over Independence Square. This revolution is moving into a new phase. But amidst the flowers and the children's tributes, flashes of something more sinister. Groups of armed men strut through the square with dubious iconography. That yellow armband is a Volksangel, a German symbol used by several SS divisions during the Second World War. Far-right graffiti is appearing, daubed on the walls of the city. The people who brought down the government were overwhelmingly ordinary Ukrainians, students and doctors, workers and even families, people who simply refused to back down. But the most organised and perhaps the most effective were a small number of far-right groups. When it came to confrontations with the police, it was often the nationalists who were the loudest and the most violent. A group calling itself the Right Sector is perhaps the largest. Its members can be seen marching around Kiev in columns of about a dozen. Mostly they carry baseball bats. Sometimes they carry guns. We met these men posing for pictures outside the burnt-out remains of what was once their headquarters. I asked them about their political beliefs.
Национал-социалистская тематика иногда в некоторых людях она есть проступает. Как бы, чтобы была единая нация. Но не у всех, это не заложено в основе этой организации, это у некоторых людей есть.
А у вас?
У меня лично есть.
В смысле? Объясните.
Мне как бы нравится эта идея единой нации. Я хочу, чтобы нация была единая, чтобы один народ, одна страна, одна нация.
А это подразумевается что?
Как бы, чтобы чистая нация. Не то, что там, как бы у Гитлера как было. В своем роде немножко, маленько, но было, чтобы своя нация.
What about the East, I asked? What about Crimea, where many Ukrainians feel close historical ties to Russia?
Кому нравится Россия, пусть едут в Россию. Украина только для украинцев.
We got a late-night phone call from another group known as C14, inviting us to meet their leader at their new base. It turned out to be the former headquarters of the Communist Party.
Since most of the deputies of the east and the south of the country are afraid to set foot in parliament. Meanwhile, all across the country, headquarters of parties are being sacked by their opponents.
Now occupied by the far right.
It's our general mission to totally ruin chains that connect our country with the imperial power from the past.
And that being Russia?
Yes, we can do Russia, not only Russia, Soviet Union.
Are you a Nazi?
No, I don't think I'm a Nazi, I'm a Ukrainian nationalist.
What does that mean?
The main confrontation is about that some ethnic groups have control many business structures, some economic, some political forces, and
which ethnic groups?
Russians and Jews and the Poles, and maybe some non-Ukrainian group control a huge percent of some economic or political power. And of course, in this situation, Ukrainian people have some tension between it, and it causes conflicts.
The fervour of the revolution is beginning to fade now. People are starting to move on. But it's clear that it was the radical groups who kept up the pressure on Viktor Yanukovych, and many of them feel that this really is their victory. The question is, how much power will that give the far right in the new Ukraine? With their anti-Russian rhetoric, events in Crimea will almost certainly play into the hands of the nationalists. No one knows exactly how strong they are in terms of numbers, but the influence of the far right in Ukraine is growing. The protesters are back, but in place of ordinary citizens, now they're battle-hardened fighters. They're the same slogans as last year. Ukraine above all else. Glory, glory, glory. But in the mouths of the right sector, they take on a more sinister aspect. Well, there can be few more poignant depictions of how unfinished Ukraine's revolution is than this sight. All of these people bearing the banners of the far-right group, these people who helped overthrow Ukraine's pro-Russian president a year and a half ago. And they've been telling me that they want to bring down this president as well. Glory to Ukraine, they shout. The banner of the right sector harks back to a Ukrainian nationalist movement from the 1940s. They say the colours represent the blood of Ukrainians spilt upon their country's black soil. Their critics call them fascists and neo-Nazis.
We all love our country. If we love our country, we are neo-Nazis or not? I think not. So I mean that we are nationalists. Revolution wasn't finished. That's why the people who don't love Ukraine came to control Ukraine. For me, it's not normal.
Now they're flexing their muscles. In recent weeks, the right sector has been involved in firefights with Ukrainian security forces in the west of the country, hundreds of miles from the front line. These clashes in Mukachevo, on the border with the European Union, were about control of lucrative smuggling routes. But it was also a show of force, a signal from a strong militia to a weak government. Don't cross us. They converged on Kiev yesterday for an emergency summit, some fresh from the front, others from the political wing of the party.
Но вот этот, это нацистская символика, это Вольфсангл.
Нет, это идея нации, это не нацистская.
Очень похож.
Это, возможно, похоже, но это абсолютно не имеет никакого отношения к нацизму. Еще раз хочу для наших зарубежных, скажем так, телезрителей сказать, мы не нацисты. Мы просто хотим жить на своей земле и быть здесь хозяевами. Я считаю, что это нормальное желание быть хозяином на своей земле.
Дуже не хотілося б, щоб, звичайно ж, човен наш державний все ж таки не розгойдувався і держава йшла послідовно. Але якщо у українського народу не буде іншого виходу, то, звичайно, що буде і Майдан.
And not just among hardcore supporters. Listen to these two middle-aged ladies, ordinary residents of Kiev.
Как-то, понимаете, никаких изменений не происходит, ни лучше не становится. Но я уже не говорю о том, что в первую очередь хотят все, чтобы закончилась, конечно, война. Ну и потом же коррупция. Все же видят, что коррупция та же самая осталась, что и было раньше. Как будто бы говорят, что все борются с коррупцией, но никто этого не замечает. И все, которые там занимают это место, они, ну что они могут новое? А вот правый сектор — это какая-то новая, так сказать, течия какая-то новая.
Мне кажется, просто нет больше никого, кто мог бы сейчас объединить людей.
This video has sent a shiver across Ukraine. The marching young men are far-right nationalists from the Nationalny Drużyny, or national militia. They're at a sacred spot, Ukraine's crucible. Maidan, Independence Square in central Kiev. This was the Maidan in 2014, as hundreds of thousands of people rallied and ultimately forced out an unpopular president. Russia branded it a coup, orchestrated by neo-Nazis and fascists. It wasn't true then, but 4 years on, Ukraine's far right is on the march, and there appears little appetite for stopping it. The national militia have permission to patrol unarmed on Ukraine's streets.
So what are we looking for, Alexander?
В первую очередь полиция попросила нас проконтролировать точки кредитирования, на которые в последнее время на которых часто начали случаться разбои. Вот. И уже косвенно мы контролируем вообще ситуацию на улице, то есть пытаемся выявить какие-то правонарушения и среагировать.
It's pretty tame stuff. They spot a woman drinking alcohol near a kid's playground.
Либо допивайте сейчас, либо выбрасывайте нам.
Не, жалко, вы бросите, деньги заплачены.
Или дома там допить, просто на детской площадке.
We then go to a place where punters can gamble on computer terminals.
Здравствуйте. Игра закончена.
We're told it's been operating illegally, as its owners allegedly have links to Russia. It's unspectacular stuff. The national militia call the police out,
Незаконный игральный бизнес.
and reluctantly they appear and go through the motions.
Национальная дружина.
What the national militia want us to film is that they're a force for good, here to restore order and make the police do their job.
К сожалению, полиция не справляется со всеми проблемами, которые существуют в нашей стране. Естественно, мы, как патриоты Украины, возлагаем эти функции на себя.
It's a message that has some resonance. There's a growing despondency here about how little has changed. The next day, we're contacted by the company that owns the gambling shop. It turns out that many of their other branches have also been raided by the national militia.
Где-то около часа дня к нам забежали группа молодых людей, человек 20-25.
This is the national militia when journalists aren't watching.
В масках, с молотками, с битами, в куртках с надписью «Национальная дружина». Они кричали «Слава Украине», еще там какие-то свои лозунги. Начали здесь все просто громить. Полная разруха. Все было побито абсолютно.
We're given other footage, which shows more places being trashed, men lighting fireworks indoors, even setting one location on fire. The national militia tell us they're working alongside the police, but they have also, on several occasions, fought them. Here they brawled and used pepper spray on officers as they tried and failed to pressure a judge into keeping an allegedly corrupt politician in custody. The national militia are part of a group called Azov. Initially a volunteer military battalion, it has well-established links to the far right. Its founder, this man Andrei Beletsky, has in the past expressed racist and anti-Semitic views. And its logo has clear Nazi overtones.
My favorite quote from Andrei Beletsky is that the destiny of the Ukrainian nation is to be an avant-garde in holy war of white people against underhumans led by Semites.
Beletsky now denies he ever said that, but as this oath-making ceremony shows, he's not running away from the dubious imagery.
Багато води витекло з того часу. Багато чого змінилося в країні.
Зараз Черкаси стало тренувальним майданчиком для військового перевороту в Україні.
Alarmist? Perhaps, but many people, not just in Cherkasy, are wondering whether the national militia are being mobilized as part of a bigger political play.
Без погодження МВД, то такого існувати в Україні не може. Якщо Аваков прийме рішення для себе, що таким чином національна дружина, яка вона є зараз, не може існувати, де люди ходять в балаклавах, де люди ходять у військовій формі, то я думаю, це питання буде рішено.
This is him, Arsen Avakov, Ukraine's ambitious interior minister. His links to the Azov group are well known. He's put their fighters on the payroll of his ministry and appointed one of their commanders, Vadim Troyan, as his deputy. The national militia may well be the extreme right's first move ahead of Ukraine's elections next year. But it's the uncertainty over who's behind them that's worrying people. Confidence in politicians and the police here is low, and for whatever reason, the national militia appear to have been given the nod to act outside the law.
Історія, вона повторюється, якщо ми подивимося, що відбувалося в Германії там 37-39 рік, да, коли воно фашизм тоді піднімався, то в принципі можна, я б їх цим самим зрівняв.
It's an apocalyptic warning, but it's a reminder that 4 years after Ukraine turned away from Russia towards Europe, the struggle for its soul is far from over.
It seemed like an odd way to spend a Saturday, watching the blood sports at a festival for far-right extremists. This was the summer of 2019, and I'd gone to Ukraine to learn more about these groups. From the crowds, one thing seemed pretty clear about them. They weren't bothered by the fact that this event was organized by the Azov movement, a far-right group that has increasingly been linked to violence around the world.
The shooter is linked to a 74-page manifesto filled with white supremacist rhetoric.
FBI agents say he expressed a desire to travel to Ukraine to fight with a far-right paramilitary group.
At least one member of an American hate group also trained in Ukraine. At least one member of an American hate group also trained in Ukraine with Azov Battalion.
According to the FBI, domestic terrorists killed 39 people in fiscal year 2019, making it the most deadly year for domestic terrorism since the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing.
The threat of white nationalism has evolved since Oklahoma City, where a domestic terrorist used a truck bomb to kill at least 168 people. Police don't tend to see such terrorists as lone wolves acting in isolation anymore. It's become clear to law enforcement that these attackers often have links to a global network, one with common goals and a shared ideology.
We are looking very hard at white supremacists or neo-Nazis here connecting through social media online with like-minded individuals overseas, and in some cases actually traveling overseas to train.
Over the last few years, experts in violent extremism have grown especially alarmed about the Azov movement. The group emerged from the revolution that swept across Ukraine in 2014, and it has gotten a lot stronger amid the ongoing war with pro-Russian forces in eastern Ukraine. The fighting in that region has become kind of ideal breeding ground for militias like Azov. At their public events, one thing that surprised me was how many Ukrainians tend to see Azov not as militants or extremists, but as war heroes. In Kiev, the capital, I watched an Independence Day parade where veterans of the Azov Battalion marched alongside other volunteer militias, surrounded by cheering crowds, who thanked them for defending Ukraine against Russia. But even at the march, there were signs of the far-right ideology that's so common inside Azov. The symbols on their flags have been especially controversial. Azov says it combines the letters I and N for idea of nation, but extremism experts see it as an emblem of Nazism.
The official symbol of Azov, it's a version of Volksangel. It was one of the symbols of one of SS division during the World War II. It is one of more or less usual symbols for neo-Nazi groups all over the world.
And it's not just about their symbols. When it was founded in 2014, Azov drew many of its commanders and recruits from Ukraine's most notorious far-right groups, including outright neo-Nazis.
We basically recruited everyone who could hold weapons in their hand when the Ukrainian state was paralyzed and the defense of Ukrainian state was totally in the hand of Ukrainian volunteers. So there were many war adventurers, guys who believe that they are on kind of ideological tour to save maybe the future of the West and so on and so forth. So
the future of the white race.
Or yes.
It's The Real News. I'm Aaron Mate. A surge of neo-Nazism and anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe has a strong U.S. tie. In Ukraine, it has just been revealed that the U.S. has supplied military assistance to the Azov Battalion, a far-right militia known as a bastion of neo-Nazism within the Ukrainian armed forces. Max Blumenthal is a best-selling author and senior editor of the Gray Zone Project. His recent piece, published by The Real News, is called "The U.S. is Arming and Assisting Neo-Nazis in Ukraine While Congress Debates Prohibition." Welcome, Max. Let's start with what you have reported for The Real News about Ukraine. You call this a truly scandalous episode of close to covert U.S. support for neo-Nazism in Ukraine. Explain what's going on there.
Yeah, the Azov Battalion is essentially a militia that's grown out of the Patriot of Ukraine Party, which was a neo-Nazi white nationalist party founded by a street demagogue named Andrei Beletsky, who has pledged to restore the honor of the white race, in his words, has through his national or social national party in the Ukrainian parliament advanced laws forbidding race mixing, this kind of thing. And the Azov Battalion became active after the civil war began in the Donbass region in eastern Ukraine, when pro-Russian separatists sought to secede, partly because of the the neo-Nazi incipiency in Kiev. They didn't want any part of it. They speak Russian. Their language is not going to be recognized by the new government. And so the Azov Battalion was ultimately incorporated into the country's National Guard and military through the Ministry of Interior, through Arsen Avakov, who's been basically a supporter of its agenda all along. He also at one point installed another figure from Patriot of Ukraine, Dmitry Yarosh, as the police commissioner in Kiev. This is another neo-Nazi figure. And, you know, all along we saw these denials, especially in 2014 during the Maidan so-called Revolution of Dignity, which was actually a right-wing nationalist coup against a democratically elected government. We heard liberal voices like Timothy Snyder or neoconservative operatives like Jamie Kirchick deny the very existence of neo-Nazism in the ranks of the Maidan. Now I think it's very clear that Azov is on the march, and I'll get to that in a minute. What I did here at The Real News was compile a series of reports, including from Azov's own website, that demonstrate that U.S. military trainers have visited Azov in the field to train and exchange logistical information.
Canadian diplomats and soldiers in Ukraine took an unusual meeting in June of 2018, one that's now coming to light. It was a meeting with one of the paramilitary units raised to fight off the Russian invasion of Ukraine's eastern provinces. One problem, that unit, the Azov Battalion, has been linked to neo-Nazism, and the Canadian military knew.
Велику, могутню і соборну. Слава нації!
An Ottawa Citizen report says Canadian forces in Ukraine produced a briefing in 2017 saying members of the Azov Battalion identified themselves as Nazis. But the June 2018 meeting happened anyway, with a Canadian forces colonel and diplomatic staff attending. The battalion published pictures on social media saying Canadian representatives expressed their hopes for, quote, further fruitful cooperation.
They appeared in uniform with Azov Battalion members who are wearing the Wolf's Angel patch, which is a Nazi SS symbol, a runic neo-Nazi symbol on their arm. This is just a scandalous spectacle. Not only that, contracts have been revealed showing that the Texas-based Airtronic Arms Company has produced PSRL-1 grenade launchers that were actually authorized under the watch of the State Department and delivered directly into the hands of the Azov Battalion. So the U.S. has armed Azov. Azov actually scrubbed photographs from its website that showed them in the field with those very weapons. One reason this is significant is because the Azov Battalion functions in a lot of ways like ISIS has in Syria and Iraq, where it receives foreign fighters. It's received sniper training from a Swedish military veteran, and it received a French farmhand named Georges Monteau. At some point in 2016, Monteau returned from Azov camps in the east with a trove of weapons that was enormous. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of pounds of C4 explosives, automatic weapons, and grenade launchers. And he was on his way to Western Europe to attack a soccer festival and carry out attacks on synagogues and mosques. This would have been one of the most significant terror attacks in recent European history. So it's a scandalous episode. And now we've learned in the last week that the Azov Battalion has formed a national corps, which is both a political party and a street militia that is deployed into the streets of Kiev. A neo-Nazi militia is deployed into Kiev. They're not fighting pro-Russian separatists. They're there to, quote unquote, restore law and order. And this is part of the wider agenda of the far-right nationalist and neo-Nazi movement in Ukraine. It's called the Reconquista. It's been spelled out by Andrei Beletsky, their chief ideologue. And the idea is to essentially recapture the so-called white countries of Europe, Ukraine being the bastion of the white reconquest of Europe. And so you have hundreds of armed neo-Nazi militia members in Kiev right now. They've actually interrupted a city council meeting. They took over a city council meeting in central Ukraine, and it's beginning to look like a putsch. President Poroshenko is weaker than ever. He's even been denounced by the Kiev Post, which is basically an arm of the pro-NATO Atlantic Council. He's, I don't know why, getting attacked by all of the pro-Maidan Western commentators. And meanwhile, this neo-Nazi putsch is happening completely beneath the radar of U.S. media. And it's absolutely terrifying, not only to the Jewish community of Ukraine, but to average Ukrainians.
All of which seems awfully weird since Ukraine is not a Nazi country. So what in the world is Vladimir Putin going on about? A lie told in bad faith, but one that almost a decade ago held a sliver of truth.
A sliver of truth.